Now that you know a little something about Docker, let's get you the Docker setup that you're going to use and the other complementary tools to support that. And this specific video is about how you get your Docker for this course, the Docker install that you're going to use on each lecture. Now, over the course of this whole thing, you may eventually run Docker different ways or other container tools. But for now, let's just focus on getting you the Docker for the main part of the Docker sections of this course. In fact, there are lots of ways to run a Docker container now, as opposed to when Docker was invented. There was really just Docker. But now we have standards in the industry and we have tons of tools. You can run them in the cloud, you can run them on servers, on your local machine, in a virtual machine, in the closet, on a Raspberry Pi, tons of ways to run Docker. But I want to focus on how you're going to learn the beginnings of Docker in this course. And Docker Inc. itself has decided to focus now on Docker Desktop as the primary means for developers, operators, sysadmins, or anyone wanting to learn Docker. That's how you should be learning Docker to begin with. Docker Desktop, I consider it the best way for you to run the Docker tools, because there's more than one, on Mac, Windows, and now Linux desktops. And you can see even by the About screen that there's more than a few tools. In fact, this is really a small subset of all the tools that come with Docker Desktop when you install it on your machine. Think of Docker Desktop as more of a tool bundler that collapses all a bunch of different tools together in an automated install and keeps them up to date for you. Now, in case you didn't know, Docker Desktop is not for servers. Docker Engine is a tiny little component of the entire suite of tools coming with Docker Desktop. And Docker Engine would go on a server that you might want to run a container on a server. But Docker Desktop itself shouldn't run on servers. You shouldn't install it on a Windows server, or if you want to try to run it on a Linux server, you're not going to run the desktop edition. You're going to go look for Docker Engine. And in case you read some of the stuff as you're setting up Docker Desktop or as you're signing up for your Docker Hub account, Docker Desktop is a part of a subscription service, but there's lots of free ways to use it. Some of the tools in it are open source, but Docker Desktop, the wrapper, the packaging that puts all this together and puts it on your machine locally, that's not open source. That is actually licensed, but good news, I have actually looked throughout all the licensing details and confirmed with one of the executives at Docker that Docker Desktop is free for learning, free for personal use, and it's only until you get into the enterprise that you have to start paying for it. So don't worry about it for this course. Even if you work in a large company and you need to use your company's computer, as long as you're just using Docker Desktop for learning, you're good to go. You're fine using it for free in this course. And as I mentioned, Docker Desktop includes many tools. The list is long. This is just a few of them, some of the main tools. There's all sorts of other things that go on in the background to make it work with VPNs, to make it work on any networks, with any of your storage locally. Now, because there's so many different ways today to run Docker or any containers, dozens of tools out there, dozens of ways in the cloud and on servers, I'm going to focus on you running it locally for the beginning parts of the course until we get to a time where you would need something like a specific server or a set of servers. So if you can't run it locally, that's okay. You can use Play with Docker and all the other things that I mentioned throughout these first few sections. But if you're able, try to get it running locally so that it'll be easier for you to do this course. Now, the next lecture has written details and links to all the places for the different operating systems for getting Docker Desktop, your code editor, all the other things you need for this course. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about why we even need to have this section. Why do we need to describe the install of Docker if it's a GUI install that's just next, complete? Why do we need to have this whole section? And there are good reasons for that. So one, each OS has its nuances and complexities with Docker or container tooling. And I wanted to highlight those things for each OS so that you could prepare now so that later on you don't hit roadblocks or hiccups. I'm classifying this as a reference section. If you are a Windows user and you have no interest in Mac, then skip the Mac video. They're not that long, but just go ahead and skip the Mac one anyway. If you're not needing to run on a Linux desktop, skip that video and just consider this as a reference section for the proper Docker setup for taking this course per OS. And in case you didn't get this point earlier in one of the first few lectures, Docker or any container requires the container image to run on a kernel that was designed for it. If you build an application for Windows, it has to run on Windows. But most containers, and I would say 98, 99% of containers, run on a Linux kernel, which means when you install Docker Desktop, or some of the alternate ways to run containers, these tools typically will manage a local VM running a tiny Linux kernel and a tiny container file system. So one of the big things Docker Desktop will do for you is manage the setup, the upgrading, the security, and then the deletion of that tiny VM all for you transparently in the background. And this is true on Windows and Mac. Even on Linux, Docker Desktop will make a Linux VM on its own, a little tiny thing in the background, to install all these tools, keep the version up to date. And when you run containers, again, on Docker Desktop for local Docker use, it's going to run all that stuff in a VM. There are many, many tools out there I've mentioned, and there's even more if you consider the cloud, but there's still a significant number of tools that aren't Docker official that could let you run containers. I like to consider all the different ways, of course, when I want to learn everything in the ecosystem, but when you first start learning, you kind of just need to learn one. So we're going to learn Docker first, and then we'll talk about other tools as they become relevant. Of all the ways to run containers, I like to classify them into three main types. What we're going to be focusing on at the beginning of this course is the first one there, locally running Docker Desktop, Rancher Desktop, one of these other tools that runs containers on your local machine. And later, you can learn how to run containers on a server with something like Docker Engine or Kubernetes itself. And then there's also cloud services that you don't even really talk to Docker or Kubernetes directly. They just run this stuff for you, like Fargate, Cloud Run, App Runner on AWS. There's all sorts of ways to run containers. In fact, now just in the clouds, there's dozens of ways because containers are now standard. And so there's a lot of ways. And maybe you decide eventually to use some other tool to run your containers on your local machine or on your servers. But for now, we're just going to focus on Docker. And what I mean by that is that Docker Engine was the first way to run a modern container in 2013. And Docker kind of invented those three different ideas that you learned about a few videos ago. But because this is all open source, all these other tools have shown up. But it's okay because they all now use the OCI standards. The Open Container Initiative, they actually have a website, link in the references for this video, but that's what all these different tools are using. So if you build an image with Docker or some other tool, no problem. All the container runtimes can run it, and there's many ways, like I said. So just think of these tools as ways to build, manage, and run containers from container images. The containers are standard through OCI. That's a standard interface. The images are a standard format with the OCI. And even the registry where we store all these images for then downloading to servers, that's a standard as well under OCI. And like I mentioned a while ago, I'm assuming that underneath all of this, that you're using the Docker CLI and the Docker engine. If you use a different tool, you could still run containers, but their commands would be different. So we want to start with Docker. It's still the most popular way to run containers on your local system. Now, I mentioned a few other ways to run containers locally, so I just want you to know this up front. Again, you're not going to download these tools yet, but there are plenty of other ways if you're not wanting to run Docker Desktop, even though it's my favorite, long term. We got this whole list here, and there's a link in the references for this video. But you can see that there's a bunch of other tools down here. You might hear things like Rancher Desktop or Multipass or Podman or Nerd Control or just there's a lot, right? And they all have different features and different focuses, and they can all run the same container images in containers. And in the next lecture, you're going to get the links to download and install Docker. And then from there, you might want to watch the specific video in this section for the operating system you're going to use in this course, Mac, Windows, or Linux.